It bothers me that my father made more money than me in the 80s and 90s than I do now. My father was a maintenance mechanic at IBM making $38 an hour. Today, I am a machinist setup programmer making $35 an hour. It's similar sort of work. I also work twice as much as he did. Something doesn't fucking add up. Story 1. My parents spent about $250, $300 a week in the 80s and 90s on smoking, drinking, and gambling. Dad was a plant operator and Mom was a cleaner. My budget is $100 a week on food currently, and I have a couple uni degrees. I don't smoke or gamble and feel guilty spending if I spend $20 on a bottle of wine a week, which I don't do every week. Just how? I miss eating decent food. Story 2. Same here, I'm a robotic programmer making about $60,000 a year. My father was a maintenance man at Ford's and made, I want to say, around $70,000, maybe $75,000. But my father had 3 kids and a wife who works a decent job at $50,000 a year. Oh wait, my wife makes $75,000 and we still live in a shittier home with no kids. I agree, something doesn't add up. Story 3. My mother-in-law had a job making $70,000 a year as a factory scheduler, so she made the schedules for what truck driver would work Monday versus Tuesday, etc. Her film reproduction degree was a 1-year course to turn VHS tapes into CDs. Since she now has 20 years of experience, she is now making well over $100,000. If you tried making $70,000 in that position now, you'd need a master's and 5 to 7 years of experience. She literally walked into the place she worked on her lunch break and got hired. Story 4. I basically watched this happen, or at least the fallout at a factory. It was locally owned, making a very technical product. They hired young people, unfortunately. They just straight up discriminated and did not hire women until the early 2000s. They invested in their workers and trained them. The pay was extremely good, especially for the area, both on the floor and in the office. People bought houses in it, had kids, retired, they had generous pensions. But the boomer owners got greedy and didn't want to just sell. They sold out. New owners decided the quickest thing they could do to save money was in the apprenticeship program. Then they had a skilled worker shortage. Then they froze pay and would only hire temps through an agency, making peanuts. You could get more once you were hired on, but not much. No more benefits. Certainly no pension. The entire area started falling into more economic despair as a result, and the people definitely did. Story 5. Yeah, I mean, if you're doing that consistently, then you're looking at $75K a year. That's a respectable wage for a full-time career server, depending on where you live. For me, in South Florida, I really need to be pushing 500 at least once a week, and a couple 400s. 300 has to be on the low end, honestly, for me to feel comfortable. Unfortunately, man, it's so sporadic, especially in a seasonal town. A lot of places I've worked in this country, you make all of your money in 3 or 4 months, and then it's a ghost town the rest of the year. I worked seasonally for most of my 20s in national parks or lake towns. That is one hell of a hectic lifestyle, moving every few months out of state trying to follow the money with the snowbirds. Story 6. I made $97 this year at my dinner job. I work 3:10 or 11 p.m. 5 nights a week. We open at 5. The first 2 hours are setting up listening to Grateful Dead or bluegrass. There's definitely some undeniable chillness to the job, but it is leveled out by the gut-wrenching constant interactions with middle-aged to elderly Karens. I mean, my sanity is tested daily, and I am burnt out by the end of the first wave of tables. I work a breakfast-lunch job 3 or 4 days a week as well during season, winter, from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. Normally make $150, $200 a day there. It's closer to $110, give or take a few grand, annually. I live in South Florida, so it's like $3 for a nice 1-bedroom with amenities. Or, like me, $2 for a bare-bones 2-1 with no amenities on the edge of the ghetto. Because I have my 2-year-old son Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. My car insurance is like $420 a month. This city definitely sucks you dry financially, so if you're not making close to 6 figures, especially as a single father, then you're struggling to pay the bills, let alone save or pay off debt. Story 7. What don't you understand? People voted to move money away from the workers and into the stock market. Look at how many billionaires we have now and multimillionaires. We wouldn't have them if wages kept up with inflation. It's cool that 5 guys have more money than hundreds of millions of people combined. It's not evil at all for people to hoard more money than they could spend in thousands of years. Story 8. Yeah, pay has pretty much stagnated at least since the 90s. Meanwhile, the cost of everything surely hasn't. Just for fun, throw that in an inflation calculator. Let's say your dad was making 38 HR in 1985. That's the equivalent to over 100 HR today. Story 9. I'm pretty sure these calculations are just wrong. I worked with payroll at a unionized factory in the early 2000s, and even the skilled trades didn't a straight hourly rate over $30 an hour. Now, with overtime and double time, they made a ton of money, but an hourly rate of $38 in the 1980s was unheard of. Story 10. People claim that is adjusted for inflation. I believe it would be better to compare and look at the percentage of income spent for expenses then versus now, rather than trying to make yesterday's money change to today's rates. Back then, people struggled to save and buy things too. Today's society doesn't account for so many additional expenses that didn't exist back then, like computers, cell phones, internet, streaming services, although there was cable in the South. Late 80s. If people weren't spending so much on those things, they would have better cash flow. Spending over $100 a month for cell phone and service and $50 or $70 a month for internet adds up fast. Story 11. I don't. But depending on their spouse's income and COL, they could still be broke. I was making high 20s 2 years ago and had just enough income to do my only hobby, shooting matches, shot no rounds outside of actual competition, and worked matches to pay for them. All my disposable income went to that, and it was about $1,500 a year. Story 12. Yeah, but it's possible in the 80s doing maintenance on one-of-a-kind machinery that was making cutting-edge technology at the time. Stuff is designed way more user-friendly and maintenance-friendly nowadays with much better diagnostic tools. Even just cars mechanics had to know much more back then to figure out what the problem was. It was easier to fix when you knew what was wrong back then, but figuring out what was wrong was much harder before we onboard diagnostics. Now, the figuring out what's wrong is easier, but fixing a lot of the stuff is harder on cars. Story 13. Only thing I can think of is I wonder if that position was much rarer and more in demand back then as opposed to now. I'm thinking that in today's tech world, there are more people that do your line of work than 35 years ago. 35.HR is still not bad, though. Story 14. My parents were able to buy a 2-acre lot and build a 2,000 SQFT home on that lot in 1992 worth $700,000 when they sold it. I can barely afford a $300,000 home now. I feel like I'm vastly behind what they were able to accomplish in their 30s, and now I'm 34. Story 15. I used $38 x hours x 52 weeks for a rough gross estimate, so before taxes. 1985 versus 2025. According to our friend in 2013dollars.com, $79,040 in 1985 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $231,752.48 today, an increase of $152,712.48 over 40 years. The dollar had an average inflation rate of 2.73% per year between 1985 and today, producing a cumulative price increase of 193.21%. A dollar today only buys 34.105% of what it could buy back then. Computing was highly specialized then. My sister, a lot older than me, made about $3.50 an hour fresh out of high school as a data entry processor in the Great Lakes non-major city area, or $7,180 a year. Comparably, that's $21,345 today. You can compare other 1985 earnings x52 here for U.S. jobs. Multiply the weekly by 52 for annual salary. Then go to the inflation calculator and compare. Regardless of profession, our dollar only earns 34% of what it used to. Also keep in mind we required much less to live on as far as rents, yes, but people could get by with no TV or no phone or rabbit ear antenna TV and one house phone, rent, heat, car or public transport, and gas if you had a car. Life was largely still analog and you could make do on much less, as life's expectations didn't include digital connectedness. Even banking now often requires smart technology, leaving more people unbanked. It's wild to think about the changes, honestly. So, OP, your comments track. Largely we work harder, produce more, rest less, and earn less to require more to live. Story 16. I feel like I need to preface this by saying that I don't think it should be this way from a purely human aspect, but capitalism is what has borne this result. With that out of the way, I have to imagine that in your father's time, there were far fewer people qualified for the work. Millennials and onward are truly the generations that have been told that college degrees are what get you anywhere. While that's not strictly wrong, what we have is a much larger percentage of the population with degrees or expertise in what used to be high-paying jobs. Companies used to have to pay you well, give great benefits, and give you enticing raises to keep you around. Nowadays, it's cheaper to shitcan you and hire the next guy eager to just finally get a paycheck after racking up tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars in school debt. Story 17. Are you apologizing for capitalism? Dude, it's all Reagan's fault. Why do you think companies stopped investing in their employees? Reagan cut taxes for companies. Why spend money when you can hoard it? He cut the top marginal tax by 45%. These tax cuts were funded by making universities charge for tuition instead of being funded by the government. Story 18. My parents and their siblings all graduated college in the early 80s, and they all said it was easier back then. You could walk in off the street and get a decent job with no or little experience. You could get a college degree in any field with no or little debt and land a good middle-class job. They all had careers, kids, and bought houses by the time they were 30. I don't know anyone who has that experience today. Story 19. Your dad had a great job at IBM. That wage, if true, was a ridiculously high for that era. Hardly anyone made money like that then. Good for him. You're getting paid what the job pays at your place. Look for a job at another company? No one owes you more money? Go get it? Story 20. Are you working for the same company he did? I worked as a mechanic and left one job for another and got a $7 an hour raise walking in the door. The next issue is in the 80s and 90s, computer tech was a high-demand job. Not a lot of people were trained in that field. Today, the market is saturated with computer techs. Story 21. You know it didn't bother a lot of people that their ancestor was a royalty or of the nobility. Even if they themselves would never rise to peerage, it really just is about perception. Besides, it's really about the current economic times, not you. Automation and offshoring have greatly decimated domestic labor demand, while at the same time, the number of workers keeps increasing. It is ultimately about supply and demand, and there's a lot more supply for the demand. Story 22. Wages have definitely stagnated, but the cost of living has soared. Your dad's $38 an hour back then would be like $100 today. Plus, with global competition, employers feel less pressure to pay well. It's a tough reality for many in the workforce now. Story 23. Yeah, I make 30 HR and I'm single male with 2 roommates. In a shitty, crappy, tiny, no washing machine having apartment. I budget tightly. I know where every cent goes. I live well below my means. I'm broke. I can't afford to travel or eat out. Cannot imagine how my parents managed to raise 4 kids. Making less than 30 HR. Seriously, how didn't I starve? Story 24. A good number of tech jobs in the 80s and 90s had far higher demand and deficient employee pools. For instance, I knew a field tech that did service on a POS system back in the 90s who made 3 figures. It was basically bequests there. Was only about 6 people in the country that were familiar with the system. The downside being that because of this, he was almost always on call and traveling. Story 31. My first job out of college paid $12 an hour in 2018. My dad told me I should be okay with that, since his first job after getting his PhD in 1989 paid the same. Of course, he was being underpaid with his level of qualifications, but that doesn't change the fact that the buying power of $12 in 1989 was over double that of $12 in 2018. Story 32. The problem is corporations having major all-time high profits while not paying fair taxes and not giving proper raises to their employees. Inflation has something to do with it. A great part of inflation is the absurd profits of corporations. Research it. We are not going back to houses being worth $15K to build with a piece of land included. Rich get richer and poor get screwed. If capitalism worked like the preach it should, the trickle-down effect. Why do we have the most millionaires in history, yet the poorest population ever? The gap is growing more every day. Story 33, 38 HR in the 80s, 90s is like 80 HR today, if not more. Story 34, 1985. Median household income, $23,620. That's $70K today. If someone was making $75K in 1985, that'd be like $220K today. UAW workers in 1985. Made between $11, $14. I remember my dad telling me that people he graduated high school with were making $18 straight out of high school. That would have been in 1970, when the internet tells me UAW workers were only making $4 an hour, $5.50 in 1975. I wonder if our dads are full of wait. If they were making wages as high as they say, that sounds like the wage gap was already started. Imagine those people making $50,000 a year buying up all the houses, pushing up real estate prices, while the $25,000 earners were saying, something doesn't add up. I think the difference today is where that wealth gap is felt. Let's say that back then, the low and low middle class was struggling to keep up. Now the middle class is too. Story 35. That's still like 72K hours a year. If you're not in California, you might be able to live above average. Story 36. There are a number of reasons beyond increasing wealth disparity and a focus on speculative wealth that has diminished your wage relative to your father's. A big one folks aren't mentioning is the transition from a manufacturing to a service economy. Folks in manufacturing got boned hard. Most folks in service also don't get paid out that well either, so it's obviously not the entire reason, but the dramatic difference between yours and your father's salary can probably fit into the economy transition. It really sucks, though, and I get why you're bitter about it. Story 37. Same with my dad. He made $38K in the 80s working for Super Value Foods as a computer programmer. He got disabled in 1985 with MS and quit working full-time a few years later. I made $38K in 2007, LOL. I make a bit more these days, but it's pretty embarrassing and disappointing. I'm not a computer programmer, but I have just as much education and experience in my field as my dad did. I don't expect to be making 6 figures, but I would like to not have to pinch pennies in the grocery line. Story 38. When I was born, my dad was making $1.05 hour HR. When my mom started working, she didn't even have an hourly wage. She got piecemeal pay. So she got paid for each coat she finished at the factory. The harder she worked, the more she made. She averaged under 1 HR. Story 39, capitalism at work doing its wonders. As long as the vast majority of people worship Trump, Harris, etc. and fight with each other, taking sides with either mainstream political party who is about power grab for themselves, the working folks will remain struggling. There is no hope cause vast majority of people aren't aware. Story 40. I understand the comments. I struggle with this myself. One thing that I try to keep in my mind is that our fathers worked in a different era of working, where the dynamics were different than they are today. It sucks today.